I was sitting in the office that had been my second home for the past 27 years. The window overlooked the city park, where I often had coffee during my lunch break. It was my favorite moment of silence before diving back into work. And now here I was, watching my desk empty. Stephanie Grayson stood before me, confident in her 28 years and her shiny resume, where every item was nothing more than the results of her father's wealth. She said coldly, "Lynn, thank you for your years of service, but the company needs new energy, new ideas. We can no longer rely on the old ways." That's what she called 27 years of my life. "Stephanie," I spoke calmly, though my insides were seething with indignation. "The old ways are the ones that kept the company from going bankrupt in 2008, the ones that made your father a legend in the business." She shrugged her shoulders. "Thank you for your input, Lynn. You have 2 weeks to wrap things up." Her words left no doubt. I was not to be seen here again. I gathered my papers and took one last look back as I left the office. Over the years, I had been through everything: economic crises, management changes, mergers with competitors. I never had an easy road, but I always found a way to make the company win. Maybe that's why I was always respected by everyone, but her. Stephanie saw me as an obstacle, a person who reminded her that the company was not only about beautiful presentations, but also about real work. But what she didn't know was that I had been ready for this moment for years. The irony was that my firing was her biggest miscalculation. I realized that her youth and ambition deserved a place in modern business, but I also knew how easily those qualities could turn against their owners. When I left the building that day, I didn't feel anger or regret, only peace and confidence that this was not the end. It was only the beginning. That night, I sat at the table for a long time with a cup of tea that had already cooled down. The kitchen was quiet. Only the dull sounds of the TV from the living room reminded me that time had not stopped. I was looking at an old yellow notebook, covered with my neat notes. It was over 15 years old. I remember the day I decided to start recording everything. I had just completed another project that saved the company from a fine of several million. The management had promised a bonus, but then suddenly announced that there was no budget. Of course, it was a lie, but at the time I had no evidence to argue. "Always document," a friend named Marta, an experienced lawyer, told me. "Records are your only ally when they decide to write off your efforts as losses." From that moment on, I started recording everything: important meetings, correspondence, even short conversations that could have made a difference. And for good reason. This notebook became my shield and sword. It contained all the little things, from unfair decisions of the management to violations that I had to cover up so that the company would not lose clients. Each entry was a key to situations that could have changed the balance of power. Looking through it that night, I realized that Stephanie could not even imagine what I was capable of. Over the past 2 years, her father had put the company in her hands, but kept it a secret until all the formalities were completed. Stephanie always thought she could manage anything, based on her degree from a prestigious university, but she didn't know how a real business works. I remembered her first step. She talked about new horizons, digital transformation, and cost optimization. I saw in her eyes what I have seen in many young executives: euphoria and a lack of understanding of how easy it is to destroy what has been built over decades. With each new decision, she pushed away experienced people and replaced them with young, energetic, but inexperienced employees. During one of her meetings, I asked her, "Stephanie, do you have a clear plan in place in case your strategy doesn't work?" She just smiled. "Lynn, I believe in my plan and I know it works. All this caution is your old approach. We have to look forward, not look back." I nodded silently, but then I made my first entry. Stephanie refused risk analysis. It was just one page of many that I filled in patiently and without emotion, not out of revenge, but out of a premonition that this moment might come. Sitting in the kitchen that night, I decided it was time to open the notebook. Inside was evidence that some of Stephanie's decisions had already put the company at risk. For example, her choice of a new supplier who offered cheaper materials but had serious certification violations. I knew this was just the beginning. My goal was not to destroy Stephanie, but to make her realize that experience was not a burden, but her only chance to avoid disaster. The next morning, I decided to take action, but it had to be done quietly, without haste and chaotic steps. Every move had to be deliberate and carefully thought out. Sitting in a nearby coffee shop, I scrolled through my phone's contact list, looking for just the right person to help. I chose Helen Brooks, a former financial analyst at the company who had left after Stephanie arrived. Helen had always had a talent for spotting things that others missed. Her decision to leave was a signal to me that if someone like her was leaving voluntarily, something was definitely wrong. "Helen, it's Lynn," I said into the phone, trying to sound casual. "Do you have time for coffee?" We met in a small cafe on the other side of town. Helen looked calm, but I saw a familiar twinkle in her eyes. She was happy to talk, even if she didn't show it. "I have a pretty good idea why you're here," she said, taking a sip of coffee. Really? "You want to know what went wrong after Stephanie came, and I'll tell you. Everything." Her words sounded straightforward. Without any unnecessary embellishments, she began to talk about how the new CEO had changed suppliers, cut back on inspections and maintenance. "She thinks an Excel spreadsheet can solve everything," Helen said, "but the numbers look better on paper than they do in reality." I started noticing gaps between the reported and actual data. If the gaps really existed, it meant that the company was already taking risks it didn't understand. "Did you keep copies?" I asked. Helen smiled. "Do you think I've worked with you for so many years and haven't learned anything?" It contained copies of financial reports that showed these gaps. It was real gold. When I got home, I connected the flash drive to my laptop. The data confirmed what I had suspected. Stephanie had been juggling numbers to create the illusion of profitability. But that was just the beginning. Her new strategy of implementing optimization was leading to the accumulation of hidden debts that would eventually surface. I started creating my own file, not to use it immediately, but to prepare myself. Every fact had to be checked, every figure confirmed. The next day, I decided to take one more step. I needed to understand how her election was affecting the staff. And to do that, I needed to talk to someone who worked with her on a daily basis. My choice fell on Jacob Langford, the head of the supply chain. He had always been a man of his word and had a reputation for integrity. "Lynn, this is unexpected," he said when I called. "Can we meet? I have a few questions about our old projects." We agreed to meet in the afternoon. Jacob looked exhausted. I knew it wasn't easy for him to work under Stephanie. "Lynn, I already suspect where you're going with this," he said after a few minutes on the phone. "Then say it straight," I asked. "She's cutting corners. Choosing cheap suppliers is just the tip of the iceberg. We've already had a case where customers received products that didn't meet the standards." She said it was a temporary problem, but we both know that's not true. Jacob also provided me with documents, reports of product quality problems, customer complaints that Stephanie ordered me to ignore. When I got home, my hands were shaking, not from fear or anger, but from the feeling that I was on the right track. My file was growing, but I knew it was only the beginning. All the details that seemed to be trivial were now forming a complete picture. Stephanie wasn't just making mistakes. Her management style was leading the company to disaster. And although I already had enough evidence to raise the issue with the board of directors, I had to act carefully. The big game, like life, is not in a hurry. I knew that if I struck too early, it would backfire on me. Before moving forward, I decided to meet with another source of information, Amanda Cross. She worked in the marketing department, but had close ties to many departments. Amanda was one of those people who heard more than they said. "Amanda, we need to talk." "About Stephanie?" she asked with a sarcastic smile. I met her in the park. A light breeze swayed the trees, and the scene seemed absurdly peaceful compared to the tension in the company. Amanda immediately understood why I had come to her. "She is destroying everything you and I have built," she said, without further explanation. She told me that Stephanie interferes in the work of every department, forcing them to complete tasks on artificially shortened deadlines. Many projects were failing at the startup stage, but Stephanie was hiding behind loud slogans about a renewal strategy. "We lost 3 clients in the last quarter alone," Amanda said, "but she makes us say we are optimizing our customer base." After the conversation, I realized that the situation was even more serious than I thought. It wasn't just chaos, but a deliberate strategy based on short-term gains and long-term risk. That quote S, where I decided to change tactics. At night, sitting at my kitchen table, I drafted an email addressed to the board members. The subject line was simple: current state of affairs in the company, urgent review required. I didn't plan to blame Stephanie. That would have been pointless. Instead, I decided to provide objective facts, evidence that could not be refuted. Reports on the decline in product quality, documents on the loss of customers, financial imbalances that were hidden from the public. But I realized that one letter would not change everything. I needed more. The next day, I deliberately came to the office to make it clear that I was here, and I knew what I was doing. To my surprise, Stephanie invited me into her office. "Lynn," she began, sitting at her large but empty desk, "I heard that you've been talking to some of our employees. You do realize that this is not conducive to harmony in the team." Her tone was arrogant, but I could see her real fear. "I'm just keeping in touch, Stephanie," I replied with a slight smile. "It's what has helped me survive here for so many years." Her face remained impassive, but I noticed her fingers drumming nervously on the desk. "I hope you're not causing any problems," she added. I simply nodded. As I left her office, I realized that her confidence had begun to waver, but the main battle was yet to come. That night, when all the conversations and documents fell into place, I realized that there was no more time to waste. Stephanie didn't know how close she was to the edge yet, but that meant I had to act faster and more decisively. My next target was the board of directors. These people were the heart of the company, although they mostly relied on reports and didn't go into details. The very structure of the board was key. If they were convinced that the company was on the wrong course, it would be a fatal blow to Stephanie. But how to approach them? Direct conflict would have been risky, so I decided to go through John Lawson, one of the longtime board members I had worked with in the early years of my career. John was one of those people who always noticed more than he said. I invited him to lunch, choosing a neutral location to avoid unnecessary attention. "Lynn, he said as we sat down. "To what do I owe this invitation?" "John, we've known each other for years," I began, "and I know you've always been committed to stability for the company. I've come to discuss something important." He raised an eyebrow, but didn't interrupt. "Recent changes," I continued, "put the company in jeopardy. I have data to prove it. I'm not asking you to take my word for it, but I want you to look at the facts." I handed him a small dossier I had carefully prepared the day before. It was just a snippet of all the information, enough to get him interested, but not overwhelmed. John opened the folder and started reading. The table was quiet for a few minutes. "This is serious," he said at last, his voice stern. "That's why I came to you. I have to discuss this with the others, but Lynn, if this is true, we're in big trouble." We said goodbye, and I felt my first relief. John was the one person who could start the processes from the inside, even if he officially stayed away. Meanwhile, the company's first failure was brewing. Stephanie started a large-scale project to upgrade the supply chain, hoping to cut costs. But due to the rush and lack of attention to detail, the new supplier failed to fulfill its obligations. Several large orders were disrupted, and customers began to express their dissatisfaction. The news spread quickly, and within a few days the whole company was talking about it. I couldn't help but smile. This project was the one I had warned Stephanie about 6 months ago. During one of the morning meetings, she tried to absolve herself of responsibility. "These are just temporary problems," she said. "We're already working on them." But her words rang hollow. "Stephanie," Jacob asked quietly, sitting in the corner, "does this mean we're going to be reviewing all new contracts?" "That's not your question," she cut him off. I didn't have to intervene. The employees' outrage was obvious. They were losing confidence in the management, and I could feel it. I watched from the sidelines, realizing that this moment was only playing into my hands. That evening, John called me. "Lynn, I saw what happened," he said. "I think it's time to act." The morning started with rain, and the gray sky accurately reflected the atmosphere in the office. Everyone spoke in whispers, and nervousness reigned in the departments. Stephanie seemed to sense it, but tried to keep her cool. I, on the other hand, felt calm. John did his part. At an extraordinary meeting of the board of directors, the issue of the company's state was raised. I knew they had already received copies of some of my evidence. A key meeting was to take place that day, and I decided to be there to get a feel for how it would go. While the board was meeting, Stephanie stayed in her office. She usually spent such days in a fighting mood, but this time her office door was closed. When the meeting was over, John came out into the hallway and took a quick look at me. "Lynn," he said, "it's all about the next step now." His words made it clear that the board of directors hadn't reached a final conclusion yet, but they were close. I decided that it was time for the first open move. That evening, I met with Amanda and Jacob, who were now fully on my side. "We need to be careful," I said, as I laid out several documents in front of them. "Everything we do needs to look professional." We decided to give the board of directors another set of data. This time, it was fresh evidence, financial reports that showed the company had already lost several million due to Stephanie's negligence. With this information, they would no longer be able to turn a blind eye to the problems. But then, something happened that I didn't expect. The next day, Stephanie called a meeting with the top managers. "We have traitors in the company," she began, her voice tense, "and they are trying to undermine our work." When I heard those words, everything inside me turned upside down. She knew something was going on, and now she was trying to make everyone afraid. During the meeting, she started pointing to specific departments, trying to blame them for the poor results. "Marketing isn't doing its job," she said, throwing a cold glare at Amanda. "Supply chain is failing us at every stage," she added, looking at Jacob. This was her strategy, to pit people against each other so that no one could unite against her. I sat in the back row and watched this play, trying not to let my emotions show. But what happened next exceeded my expectations. Jacob, who was usually hard to get to say anything, suddenly raised his hand. "Stephanie," he said, his voice calm but firm, "do you really think we're the problem?" The room froze. "What else?" Her answer was sharp, almost defensive. "The problem is that your solutions are creating these problems. You have brought in suppliers who do not fulfill their obligations. You have reduced inspections, which has led to a drop in quality. These are your actions, not our mistakes." Her face changed. For the first time, I saw her confidence leave her. It was the moment when something important began to change in the office. When the meeting was over, I noticed that many employees started talking to each other. They were no longer afraid to talk about problems. That same night, I received a message from John. "Lynn, the board has decided to call for an internal audit. This is your chance. It was a turning point." Word of the board's decision to conduct an internal audit spread through the office like wildfire. Everyone was whispering, and some were even trying to figure out who had initiated the audit. Stephanie was trying to act confident, but I could see cracks appearing in her mask of calm. The audit was my chance. It was the perfect moment to bring up all the data I had collected over the past months and let it become part of an official investigation. The first step was to contact the head of the audit team, Kevin Marshall. His team was responsible for reviewing the company's key processes. We met in his office, which resembled an archive with documents stacked on his desk. "Lynn, I hear you have something to say," he began, leaning back in his chair. I placed a neatly prepared folder in front of him. "This is only part of it," I said, "but it's enough to give you an idea of what's going on." He opened the folder, looking through the documents with underlined numbers, notes, and dates. "If this is all true," he said after a few minutes of silence, "we'll have to act fast." "I'm ready to help," I replied, realizing that there was no going back from this point. Meanwhile, Stephanie tried to control the situation. She called an emergency meeting with several managers loyal to her, trying to reassure them and develop a defense strategy. But panic had already begun to take over. "The audit is a formality," she told them. "We'll just show what we need to show, and that's all." She clearly didn't expect any of her team to start having doubts. But Amanda, who was at the meeting, later told me that several people began to openly question her decisions and their implications. That was the beginning of the end for her credibility. As the audit officially began, I provided Kevin's team with more documents, including fresh reports of supply chain disruptions that had occurred due to her hasty changes. And then an incident happened that changed everything. Stephanie showed up at Kevin's office one morning. She was furious, her voice echoing down the hall. "This is ridiculous," she shouted. "You're letting people who don't understand strategy dictate how I work." Kevin, who was a calm and steadfast man, just sat at his desk and waited for her to finish. "Stephanie," he finally said, "our work is not personal. We just want to make sure the company runs efficiently." But that didn't reassure her. She knew her reputation, and possibly her job, was at stake. That evening, she sent an email to all employees with the subject line, "Protecting the company's interests." In it, she tried to portray the audit as a routine check and urged everyone to cooperate. But the effect was the opposite. People realized that something was wrong. Meanwhile, Kevin called me. "Lynn, your documents are helping a lot," he said, "but there's something else. We found some correspondence where Stephanie orders us to ignore certain internal procedures." I couldn't help but smile. It was proof that could not be refuted. "What now?" I asked. "We will complete the audit in a few days. Then there will be a report for the board of directors." This meant that Stephanie only had a few days left before the truth would come out. The day came when the audit team presented their report. The board meeting was closed, but everyone in the office could feel the tension hanging in the air like a thunderstorm. I stayed at home, knowing that the time had not yet come to act openly. But I did have one reliable informant on the board, John Lawson. At 3:45 in the afternoon, his name came up on the phone. "Lynn," he said in a serious voice, "this report, it's worse than I expected. All the information I provided was confirmed. But the worst part is that Kevin's team found even more than I knew. They found that Stephanie had not only concealed financial losses, but also information about the disruption of contracts with key clients, forged signatures on certain documents, and gross violations of security procedures. The board is shocked," John continued. "Several members are already talking about the need to remove her. But there is one problem. She still has the support of several senior members. This was not a surprise. Stephanie has always been a master of persuasion, and a few influential people still believed in her modernization. So I decided to take the final step. The next morning, I prepared a special package of documents. These were materials that I deliberately did not hand over to the auditors. They contained evidence of how certain board members had ignored warnings that had been coming before Stephanie arrived. These documents contained letters where they approved risky deals, demanding quick results. I knew that these people were the key to Stephanie's ouster. They were protecting her not out of loyalty, but out of fear that their own irresponsibility would be exposed. That same day, I sent these documents to John with a short note. "John, now you know everything. If you want to save the reputation of the company and the board, you need to act. Justice is long overdue." A few hours later, he called. "This is exactly what we need," he said. "Lynn, get ready. There's going to be a lot of noise." The real explosion happened 2 days later. At an extraordinary board meeting, Stephanie was called to answer questions. It was an informal interrogation, but I knew she would have to answer a lot of unpleasant questions. She, of course, tried to be confident. Her standard phrases about temporary difficulties and adaptation strategy had already lost their effect. But when John stood up and said, "Stephanie, how do you explain the forged signatures on the documents related to the supplier agreement?" Her face changed. "It was a mistake," she replied, trying to remain calm. "It's not just a mistake," John said. "It's a deliberate violation." The situation began to unfold in her favor. One by one, the board members asked questions, and she became increasingly confused in her answers. Finally, one of the most influential members of the board, Richard Graves, stood up. "I think we have to make a decision on her continued tenure." This was the moment I had been waiting for. The decision on Stephanie's fate had been a long time coming, but her position was weakening by the minute. The next morning after the board meeting, I received a short email from John. "Stephanie is temporarily suspended. Get ready for the official announcement." The news quickly spread through the company. Everyone was shocked, although some expected it to happen sooner or later. After that, a meeting of the entire management team was called. I attended, sitting in the back row, watching Richard Graves begin his speech. "Colleagues, recent events have shown that our management methods need to be reviewed. We are temporarily appointing a new acting CEO, and the board is committed to ensuring that the situation is handled with the utmost professionalism. He didn't mention a name, but I already knew it would be someone from the board, experienced but controlled enough to avoid further scandals. Stephanie was not at the meeting. I found out later that her office was sealed and her personal belongings were collected for her to take away. But that was not all. I knew that after Stephanie's resignation, some board members would try to cover it up. Their names were already on my list, those who had turned a blind eye to the problems for years, who supported her decisions even when it was harmful to the company. So, before the situation died down, I took one last step. I handed over all the data I had collected to a journalist from a business newspaper who had long written about corporate fraud. "This is not a personal revenge," I said when we met. "It's an attempt to protect those who remain in the company and not let it happen again." The article came out a week later, and it was shocking. It described all the financial irregularities, negligence, forgery, and those who were behind it. The names of the company and the names of the people involved quickly filled the news. The board of directors had to react. All those involved were fired, and the company launched an internal program to restore trust. What about me? 2 weeks after Stephanie's resignation, I received a call from Richard Graves. "Lynn, the board has decided that we need someone to help stabilize the company, and that person is you." He asked me to take over the company temporarily during the restructuring period. I realized that it was a risk, but I also realized that I could do something really useful. "I accepted," I said. The first weeks as acting CEO were intense. I knew it was a temporary role, but I took it seriously. My goal was simple: to restore trust in the company and bring stability back. Meeting after meeting, department after department, I talked to employees to understand their needs and concerns. At first, many were suspicious of me because they saw me as a symbol of the past. But over time, their faces softened, and I heard them say things that had previously seemed unattainable. We feel part of something big again. My first big action was transparency. I called a general meeting and told everyone about the state of affairs in the company. No sugarcoating, no tricks. "We have made mistakes," I said, looking out into the room, "but that doesn't mean we can't fix them." These words sounded simple, but the effect was significant. People realized that they were now treated as partners, not just executives. Meanwhile, the company began to recover from the scandal. We restored the lost contracts by offering our customers individualized terms. The procurement department returned to trusted partners, and employees were given the opportunity to participate in decision-making. One of the biggest changes concerned the corporate culture. I insisted on introducing open communication channels where everyone could express their thoughts or concerns without fear of being punished. Stephanie. Her name was never mentioned in the company again. She tried to get back into the business through another field, but her reputation was already tarnished. What about me? 6 months later, the board of directors offered me a permanent position. I refused. "This company deserves a new leader," I said at my last meeting with the board. "But now that it's on the right track, I'm ready to hand over the reins." I spent my last day in office in my old office, going through paperwork and closing out the final details. Amanda and Jacob stopped by to say goodbye. "Lynn, you've done more for this company than anyone," Amanda said. "It's been our job together," I replied. When I left the office that evening, I felt relieved for the first time in years. I knew I had done the right thing. Afterward, now I work as a consultant for other companies, helping them avoid the mistakes that almost destroyed mine. My name is no longer associated with scandals, but with honesty and professionalism. Life has taught me an important lesson. Leadership is not about control or power. It is about trust, honesty, and the ability to listen to people.